This is a story about a frog. You place a frog in boiling water, it jumps straight back out. But you place a frog in room temperature water and slowly bring it to the boil, well, then the frog just sits there until it boils alive. Ponds and lakes don't, as a rule, heat up from low temperatures to boiling point over very slow periods of time, and so not common enough that behavioural adaptation would be evolved through epigenetics, that is, the present environment producing a genetic change in future generations of frog. And so, being a redundant concern for our frog, when placed in a fabricated human experiment, its brain has no policy on appropriate and rational behaviour. It just sits there, while we observe a kink in the matrix. Now let's jump into a quick simple example of how you and I might fit into this story. You and I are now frogs, and water temperature is how we measure credit card debt. Room temperature is zero debt, and the more debt we're in, the hotter the water gets. Now, if we get slapped with a 20% interest fee on borrowing $2,000, we get a bill for $400. That water suddenly gets really hot. While it's not pleasant, this is quite easy for the human brain to comprehend. For a single action, there is a simple and swift reaction. We're able to anticipate this consequence without too much thought before we even receive our credit card. The water gets hot really quickly, and we have evolved the mental faculties to begin dealing with the problem. The frog knows to jump out of the water, and it knows it needs to deal with the debt. But now we add compound interest into the equation, and here's where the water gets murkier, and its effects far more protracted. Every month, a collective 20% interest charge for each day is added to both the $2,000 balance and the previous interest charges if the balance isn't completely paid off. Suddenly, rather than the single reaction to a single action world we have evolved to make decisions in, we are transformed into a fabricated human experiment in which the subjects are boiled slowly and unnaturally over time. This world does not conform to the learned genetics of the thousands of generations before you. It's a world you are not evolved to compute with your brain. The water gets hot but very slowly, and your destiny is figuratively like that of the humble frog. With the story out of the way, we're on to part 2, science, to see what objective truths the story might highlight. But first, with an essential caveat. Science isn't broken, but it's a hell of a lot harder than we give it credit for. To paraphrase the data analysis blog 538, what does this mean? Well, humans are not rational creatures. Scientists are no different. We see patterns, we unconsciously jump to conclusions, we screen data to confirm our hypotheses, and as a result, struggle to replicate findings. Point is, just because I mentioned the word science doesn't mean you should take these studies as gospel. Lessons can be taken, but sleep with one eye open. Correlation is not causation. Read my favourite book in the world to understand more. In the Book of the Eskimo, Danish author Peter Freuchen had just returned from a walrus expedition with a tribe of Inuit hunters in Greenland. We learned that his group had not had much success, coming home hungry and completely drained from a day of fruitless hunting. Fortunately, a hunter from a neighbouring group noticed, and suddenly it seemed hundreds of pounds of meat was generously shared with the author's group. After thanking the hunter profusely, the reply back would baffle Freuchen. Translated into English, the hunter said, "By gifts one makes slaves, and by whips one makes dogs." What he meant was that it was absurd for the author to thank him, because on other days it might just have easily been the opposite way around. And this is the way many of us live among our close family friends and, if we're lucky, our neighbours. We live alongside others, building trust on the strength of reciprocation. Historically, it was a reliable indicator of trust. This collective wisdom has passed through generations of Inuits who have shared a common lifestyle and group size for centuries. Assuming the culture and environment doesn't change too much in the future, it's an observation that will likely be valuable for generations to come. You might even say that the number of generations a piece of wisdom has survived in a culture is proportional to the intrinsic value of that advice, assuming the conditions surrounding that wisdom don't change. To play on an Abraham Lincoln quote, you can fool all of the people some of the time and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people over generations and generations of living the same life over and over. So considering this wisdom cemented itself in a small society of hunter-gatherers, what might that tell us about give and take in modern societies? Anthropologist David Graeber decoded this wisdom bite into the language of debt in his book Debt, The First 5,000 Years. Rather than seeing himself as human because he could make economic calculations, the hunter insisted that being truly human meant refusing to make such calculations, refusing to measure or remember who had given what to whom, for the precise reason that doing so would inevitably create a world where we began comparing power with power, measuring, calculating, and reducing each other to slaves or dogs through debt. This is an interesting observation and a belief no doubt rooted in generations of Inuit experience, advice passed down between relatives culminating in what has become shared wisdom and cultural compatibility. This is exactly how lessons were passed down for millennia when humans lived as hunter-gatherers, in group sizes that remained around the same. Among the Inuits, debt is built on an emotional connection, and it's that engine of human behaviour which keeps it manageable and humane. In the modern world, however, debt is built on extrinsic obligation, a world that sacrifices human connection for the benefit of scale, a world that removes millennia-old mechanics of camaraderie in the human brain, and with it, our sense of respect and concern for one another in the cultural diversity of modern life in large cities. So ancient wisdom doesn't translate easily into modern society. At the end of this episode, we're going to do a fun thought experiment with this, but for now we'll accept that with scale, with larger group sizes and incompatible belief systems, bonds forged through reciprocation naturally die down as we reach the limits of memory and relatability for meaningful human relationships. Broadly, beyond a certain point, we go from feeling empathy and concern for people we can relate to as if ourselves, to what you might call an abstraction, as a collective concept of a group that we can't emotionally engage with. As Joseph Stalin once said, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. A person within a statistic puts them at risk of being dehumanized, as Dr. Philip Zimbardo discovered with his Stanford University prison experiments in the 1970s. By doing something as seemingly trivial as replacing someone's name with an identifying number, there was an increased risk of them becoming a recipient of sadistic practices. Dr. Zimbardo, by way of example, says that we should not label people without homes as homeless people, but as people without homes. Implicitly, the person without a home is still categorized as a person, but a homeless person is categorized differently and therefore not seen as an equal. This brings up a curious point, and one that worryingly seems to imply that there are limits to empathy. So how credible is this idea? Evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar coined what is now called Dunbar's number in the 1990s. As Wikipedia states, this is a suggested cognitive limit to the number of people or animals with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. It's a fascinating idea in the context of politics and effective representation. Primates, for example, are said to thrive in groups of up to 30. Humans with their larger neocortex can thrive in groups of up to 150, although this is only an average number. In his research, Dunbar unearthed a remarkable consistency between effective group sizes amongst our ancestors at different times. The average group size among modern hunter-gatherer societies, where census data existed, was 148.4 individuals. Company size in armies, whether the Roman Empire, 16th century Spain, and 20th century Soviet Union, revealed groups, once again, of around 150. More recently, Dunbar collaborated with Durham University to examine the destinations of Christmas cards sent from households all over the UK, still a common practice in these parts. Dunbar and Hill had each household list its Christmas card recipients and rate them on several scales, and once more, the data corroborated the previous research. The study found that the maximum network size averaged 153.5 individuals. Throughout human history, it seems, group sizes in many contexts have ebbed and flowed from and back to this natural number of optimal collaboration. This natural limit evolved in us for the hunter-gatherer society, which until recently represented most of our history and brain evolution. But given the dissonance between the world our brain evolved for and the world we've now created for ourselves, these findings haven't been translated into that most important and evolved form of group collaboration in the modern world, which is what we might collectively call contemporary democracy. While admittedly a very challenging task, the data suggest we should at least consider its implications if we want to reduce the divisions we see today as technology further disrupts the capacity for rational discussion with so many dissenting opinions. By way of example, it seems we're living in a society designed for modern state-of-the-art Tesla engines, but we're still using two-stroke gas guzzlers to navigate it. And until we can truly upgrade those old engines, we need to design systems which enhance what we've got, rather than exacerbating our weaknesses in a blind pursuit of misguided progress and wealth. Basically, if we want more compassion and convergence in politics, then we would be remiss to ignore it. With regards to the topic of today's episode, debt, I would argue that it's this limit, this blind spot, that facilitates a society in which predatory lending habits persist. More broadly, governments employ people to make decisions that will affect thousands, if not millions, of people. And whether those consequences are considered to impact an abstracted statistic of people, or a person you can see and hear in your mind, changes the conditions around which any decision is made. And yet, this is not even a perceived problem in government, as far as I know. You might think that pushing the proverbial red button on ants is not the same as pushing the red button on humans, but then consider the question of comparing ants to demographics. Can we really feel as much emotion for the abstracted concept of a demographic in the brain? I'm speaking of the difference in neurological activity, of thinking about a demographic and then thinking about a single human being. We didn't evolve to feel love for demographics. And yet this is a distinction which doesn't exist in politics. It's assumed that the love a politician expresses for one voter at a rally is the same as the feeling towards the statistical demographic of voters. There are limits to empathy, and I would argue that not seeing that can only hinder the quality of our political systems. I would argue that this lack of emotional resonance trivializes the decision-making process and leads to scenarios where predatory compound interest is perceived to be acceptable as long as customers are shown exonerating legalese they don't understand. A consumer's understanding of compound interest is typically established in states of economic desperation, reducing the capacity for long-term rational thinking against the immediate need to put food on the table. Few people would say no to a life jacket when they've been treading water in the Pacific Ocean for 5 hours, no matter what the long-term cost. This may sound like hyperbole, but survival at many levels is an unconscious reflex. This lack of emotionality leads to scenarios where sugary foods have labels in grams, yet the governments and World Health Organization educate people in teaspoonfuls. No more than 7 teaspoonfuls of sugar per day comes the advice, the equivalent of teaching in Mandarin when we're reading in Swahili. Emotionality forces people to think harder about problems they implicitly care about, and when decision makers instead are given subjects they can't relate to, the incentive instead becomes careers, money, and recognition. The pleasure in caring for people goes out of the window because governmental workers are not getting tangible signals that their efforts are meaningful and helpful. It's not the fault of the humans who can't care about what they can't relate to on a personal level. It's the fault of the system which fails to ignite human emotion. Just as we see finite limits on empathy, losing the social lubricant of reciprocation that builds trust, so too we find it easier in large societies to hold people under debt, and punitively through compound interest. This is what happens when trust is dead. So how did modern society replace that if we accept that trust is a depleting resource? As Graeber says in his book, the value of a unit of currency is not the measure of a value of an object, but the measure of one's trust in other human beings. Well, this is a complex topic, but it involves the replacement of bottom-up policies in group bonds that we've been talking about with top-down policies from government, with things like, broadly, the rule of law and the enforcement of it through personnel and contracts. No matter how anti-government and pro-market you may be, most people, I'll wager, would admit that in the large 150-person plus societies we have today, these are examples of where government is essential, at least in scenarios where government can't be influenced by money. When we surpass the natural limits of 150-person group sizes, an elected body in some form must begin compensating for those limits. Reciprocation fails when 3,067 people now owe you money. And that brings us onto the pertinent question here. So how are we performing at managing debt in the 21st century, in the so-called developed world? Is it working well? Let's have a look, shall we? Average American household debt, $5,700. Average for balance-carrying households, $16,048. Total outstanding US consumer debt, $3.4 trillion. Total revolving debt, $929 billion. 38.1% of all households carry some sort of credit card debt. Households with the lowest net worth, zero or negative, hold an average of $10,308 in credit card debt. Now, I'm no financial or fiduciary expert, but I don't think those numbers indicate a system that's working. What I see is a deficit of empathy producing a predatory lending environment which leads us to overwork problems before those with the power feel obligated to fix the problem. As it is, the people in society who could fix the problem don't feel invested enough to remedy the problem. Again, this comes down to emotion, the driver of behaviour, and no doubt a little bit of out of sight, out of mind through the confirmation bias, that is, paying attention to only that which confirms the worldview that avoids inconvenient truths. And credit card companies seem to know this implicitly. They advertise to the minimum level of clarity the law requires and no more. And for good reason. A 20% guaranteed rate of return puts you in the league for the world's most successful investor, Warren Buffett. Usury is easy money if the law colludes with you. And yes, ignoring problems still makes you culpable as a government. The simple truth is, everything we have is owed to the people who came before us. Without them, collectively, we'd still be living in caves at this point. Our language, our wealth, our opinions, our cultural beliefs, the food we eat, the people we feel a kinship with, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Our collective ancestry, in ways that we can barely comprehend. Unfortunately, even though this may be the case, we have a bias for the present, and our limited attention spans means that thinking in this broader way isn't very actionable. But it does raise an interesting point about entitlement nevertheless. What entitles a person born into wealth the opportunity to lend easy money with steep interest charges? And what entitles the person born poor to be a recipient of that slippery slope? These are philosophical questions I don't personally have concrete answers for, but if you have a moment, please share your thoughts below. We've learned, I hope, in this episode some of the reasons why a predatory system of debt persists, but to finish out here as a practical takeaway, I would like to do a thought experiment by using Dunbar's number in the context of the modern developed world. What if we applied the max 150-person rule to decision makers in councils and in government? What if no one decision maker made decisions without first consulting the fewer than 150 people in his or her constituent? These are people he or she exchanges Christmas cards with. There is an emotional bond. Then decisions constituting multiple constituencies for factors affecting larger areas are arrived at democratically by compounding the votes. From there, a machine can count the votes, and we therefore negate any need for a top official to make the final call. It's a flat management structure mirroring innovative businesses like Valve, which popularized the organizational arrangement in business. There's no hierarchy, no bosses, and no opportunity for the rare oddball to hijack democracy. Best of all, it's working for them. This of course has parallels with the systems many countries use today, and on the same token might be a tad idealistic to hope that it could improve. But if there's any question I want to ask you today, it's how do we introduce more compassion into politics? If anything, we're currently going in the opposite direction, it seems. How do we systematically augment the ability of public workers to think more emotionally about problems and with more concern for how others think? How do we begin to organise democracy around inherent biological limitations of empathy rather than living by the ignorant credo, bigger is better? Let's continue the thought experiment. Each council of no more than 150 people might be called a canton, after the Swiss administrative subdivisions that determine the powers and responsibilities of its municipalities. Every person in the community becomes a contributing member of society, with the decisions and debates they are involved with, some liberally choosing to be more involved than others. By empowering smaller groups of people, we avoid the phenomenon of bad decisions that are made from up top when leaders make decisions for people they're too distant from, both physically and socially. The human brain's tendency to jump to conclusions before getting all the information, as my favourite thinker Daniel Kahneman has written about extensively, leads people to overconfidence in their decisions. If we can't relate to groups of more than 150 people, well, what happens when you add 200 kilometres of space between the decision maker and the people? By concentrating decisions closer to home, a process called devolution, nuanced problems can, in theory, be more accurately appraised, and emotionality is increased, incentivizing public workers to think harder about problems, even if it is a selfish interest partially. In smaller groups, bad decisions are also more easily pivoted from, and problems more easily diagnosed. And very pertinently to today's world, depending on your politics, by democratizing democracy further, it's a systemic protection against dictatorships. As a recent article for Pacific Standard called for, in an era of increasing distrust for governance institutions, we should return to the local level and rebuild our civic muscles. Power has a perverse tendency to change people. The person we vote in is not always the person who serves, particularly if their background wasn't in public service. Avoiding this risk might be a smart move. Assigning decision makers to be concerned about statistics rather than people is the difference between making decisions for objects and making decisions for your own living, breathing kind. It pays to play into the hand of attention resonance and perhaps a little selfish interest. So how might this be implemented? Well, what if we could leverage new massively parallel communication technologies like the internet to more ably curate democratic opinions into what democracy truly and collectively wants? Until now, without the internet, people didn't have such a parallel platform through which to organise this. By facilitating the opinions of more people, perhaps we could even go about crowdsourcing the questions that need actioning. By asking the right questions, we make progress before even finding the democratic answer. Instead of setting Facebook as your homepage, it's your local canton's website, presenting live polls currently running that you're free to get involved with. One vote is tied to one physical address, easily verifiable given that the network is reasonably small. There are still many problems with this, however. The risk of hacking, the risk of money distorting motivations, the risk of strong personalities hijacking independent reasoning by rallying voters around their vision, the many unconscious biases that underplay the pursuit of rational thought. To be clear, this is purely an intellectual exercise and by no means a practical plan, but it illustrates, I hope, the essential ingredient that is emotion when decisions are being made that will affect the economic futures of millions of people. Currently, this seems to be a problem that, rather than being acknowledged, isn't even on the radar of politicians. You ask a politician whether they feel emotion for the decisions they make, the answer is going to be yes. It could be genuine from their perspective, it could be a lie. Ultimately, the system is what produces much human behaviour. Ethical, conscious volition in a broken system is tenuous at best. Culture is typically vastly cumulative, not totalitarian. By introducing empathy into democratic decisions, we might incentivize people to consider problems through the perspective of a group size that we have evolved for. The tribes that brought us to the eventual modern world, which metastasized from a manageable scale of human judgment. By having faces tied to decisions rather than Excel spreadsheets, we think harder about problems. At the risk of sounding corny, democracy is not about me, it's about us. So perhaps it's time we started feeling that rather than talking about it. If you enjoyed today's episode, why not consider purchasing one of the books that inspired today's show? It helps the authors who write, me who produces, and you who implements. Thanks for watching, share your thoughts below, strike a like, and if you're feeling really daring, hover over the subscribe button and see what happens.